Okay, so I'm actually going to read 2 chapters today because chapter 32 is really short. It's literally a page and a half and then it's done. So I'm going to read 2 chapters. So chapter 32 is called Really Nice. Back at the Ward's house, meanwhile, there was an after effect from the visit to Aunt Annie's. It may have been caused by laughing more than he, Mr. Carter inside Ryan that is, had for years, or it may have been too much breathing in the, well, fumes. But Ryan suddenly felt a bit queasy, so he went to bed. Mr. Carter had been ill quite a lot when he was a child, but it still felt strange as a grown man to go to bed at 6 p.m, particularly under a duvet with pirates on it. A duvet, in fact, that Ryan, in Ryan's body, had been telling Tina for some time that he'd grown out of. But then Tina came in and asked him if he was okay, and Ryan said that he still felt a bit sick, but not too bad. So she put a hand on his forehead and kissed him on the cheek, and then tucked him in and told him not to worry, she was sure he'd feel better soon. And that didn't feel strange. That felt nice. Really nice. Chapter 33 is called That's My Problem. Standing outside Mr. Carter's room, waiting to be let inside by the nurse, Mr. Carter, feeling very much like who he really was, Ryan, wondered why he'd come. In Mr. Carter's flat, having heard the message, he'd suddenly felt he should. In the forefront of his mind, it was just that he felt sorry for Mr. Carter's mum. He didn't think that she should have to be on her own in hospital just because he and her son had switched bodies. He realised after thinking this that the word just was a bit odd in this sentence. But in the back of his mind, he knew it was because he wanted to talk to his mum, and Mr. Carter at this moment and Mrs. Carter at this moment kind of was his mum. It was a funny sort of hospital, St. Winifred's. Mr. Carter had got there easily. He'd passed it many times as Ryan on the way to and from school, but he'd never been inside before. It didn't have a big reception area like most hospitals, with lots of people queuing and babies crying and the odd man with a bleeding head shouting at his wife about how he hadn't been drinking, well, not that much anyway. It was very quiet and carpeted and calm, more like the bed and breakfast in Dorset, to which his mum took him and Holly for their summer holidays. And instead of having to spend ages with a harassed-looking person in front of a computer trying to work out which ward the patient he was trying to visit was in, Zadie the nurse just met him at the door and led him across the hallway to Mrs. Carter's room. "I don't know if she's awake," said Zadie in a very hushed voice. "She's been sleeping a lot." "Okay," said Mr. Carter, "but I'm sure she'll be pleased to see you, if she wakes up." Mr. Carter nodded, but inside Ryan was nervous. Mrs. Carter sounded sicker than he'd realised. Plus, the idea of anyone being pleased to see Mr. Carter seemed weird to him. In fact, the idea of Mr. Carter having a mum, of any teacher having a mum or dad, had never really occurred to him before. But there it was, a sign outside the door. Grace Carter. Quietly, Zadie opened the door. Inside was a pleasant room, all painted in white, with a view of a garden through the window. At the far end of the room stood a bed. In it, propped up a little by pillows, was an old lady asleep. She had white hair and a sweet face. You wouldn't have known she was ill, except for a tube that went from the machine at the side of the bed into her nose. "I'll leave you. Just call if you need anything," said Zadie, shutting the door. "Don't," said Mr. Carter had wanted to say. "Don't leave." But he was stuck being an adult, being more of an adult than he'd had to be so far, and so he just nodded. He went over to the bed. Grace Carter was breathing in a shallow way. As he sat down on the chair next to the bed, her eyes half opened. She smiled and frowned at the same time, as if the smiling caused her some pain. "Michael," she said, "how nice of you to come." "Michael?" thought Mr. Carter. "Who's Michael?" Then he realised, "Oh, it's me. Well, Mr. Carter." That's okay," he said uncertainly. Then more uncertainly, "How are you?" She smiled again and frowned again. "You know, I've been better, but mustn't complain." "Well, you could." She opened her eyes a bit more. "Pardon?" "I'm just saying, if I were you, I'd be complaining a lot. I always complain when I'm ill. He was about to say my mum says, and then remembered that would sound strange. Grace shook her head, but she continued to smile. "Not really, Michael. You were always very stoic." "Stoic?" "Yes. When you were ill, which was quite a lot when you were little, you would always just sit there and hardly ask for anything. It was all I could do to get you to stay off school." "Oh, right. Yeah, I forgot." Grace carried on looking at him. Then she said, "You know, darling, now that we're talking about all that, about things in the past, I don't want to leave too many things unsaid." "Right," he said, not really understanding what this meant. "I think that happens a lot, you know, at times like these, when there maybe isn't much time left, and then people, they regret it. They regret what they didn't say." "Right. And I think Dad, when he was alive, maybe encouraged you to be a little, you know, stiff upper lip and all that. To not really say how you feel because he wasn't very comfy, was he, with feelings? And I wouldn't want you to be like that, to think you couldn't say how you feel." "Okay. Because even though you are like your father in many ways, in some other ways, like when I look at you now, I see the little boy inside you, the little boy you once were. He's still there, I think, even though he's forced to wear this big, stern, grown-up suit of armour with the armour of a body the whole time." She reached out and took her hand in his. She reached out and he took her hand in his. It was thin and light but warm. She was looking at him more closely now. "Michael, are you crying?" "Am I?" He realised he was. "Oh dear, I'm sorry. You never cry." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the one that wasn't holding hers, and sniffed. "Sorry." "No, it's okay, Michael, really. That's exactly what I'm talking about." She paused, still smiling, but a tear, just one, dropped slowly from her right eye, shining down her cheek. "I'm glad, really." She squeezed his hand. "Hello," said Zadie, coming softly into the room. "Sorry, Grace, Michael, but it's time for Grace to have some of her pain-killing medication." Mr. Carter looked round. Grace let go of his hand. She nodded. "You'd better go, darling. Thank you so much for coming. I know you have a lot of work to do." He nodded and got up. Zadie went round the other side of Grace and started preparing a syringe. "Especially with the new school. How's it going?" Said Mr. Carter, putting his coat back on. "Well, actually, it might get closed down if we fail the inspection, which is in 6 days' time." Suddenly, with a sharp pang, he thought of Diona. "You think you can turn it round?" she asked. He said again. This was a tough one, but all at once it came to him. To Ryan Ward, inside the body of Michael Carter, the head teacher of Bracket Wood School, he knew exactly what to say. "Listen, Mum, you don't you worry about that. That's my problem." And he walked out of the door. And that is the end of part 3.